Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. My regular listeners will recall that we had a great deal of technical difficulties yesterday. The program was interrupted several times, and at one point I even had to reboot my computer. Technical difficulties happen from time to time, but yesterday was a very critical time during the reading of this book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. We're talking about a period of time when the world, the Roman Catholic world especially, was in an uproar to have the Jesuits abolished. And they were abolished by Pope Clement XIV. This is a most important period for our understanding as to what exactly took place. Important that we understand what role it played in establishing the Jesuits in the capacity that they are today. The abolition by a papal bull or brief or whatever you want to call it of the Jesuits in 1773 by Pope Clement XIV is, well, let's just put it this way: the times and events leading up to the suppression of the Jesuits, what occurred at the time of the suppression of the Jesuits, and what has occurred since the abolition of the Jesuits is critical for our understanding. And this is the part of the book that deals with that. And I think it best that we back up from where we left off yesterday and cover all the material that we covered the day previous and think and discuss this more. Now, my regular listeners know that the best way of learning is repetition. So you won't be offended by this, and I think you might be even impressed with what may come out of this discussion. For new listeners, my backing up in reading this book won't bother you at all, and I just think the information contained herein is just too important to blow by or to have chopped up by technical difficulties. So I'm going to begin in the first full paragraph on page 238 if you're following along in the book. The first full paragraph on page 238. Now he says, remember, the Jesuits have been suppressed, 1773, by Pope Clement XIV. And R.W. Thompson tells us, to give effect to the decree of abolition, the general of the Jesuits was arrested and held in confinement. Now let me stop right there. The Jesuit general at that time was Lorenzo Ricci. You might call him Lawrence Ricci. Lawrence Ricci was obviously in abject rebellion against the papacy. You know, those same words were used against the Protestant reformers who called the Pope Antichrist and left the church and started the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants, who were in no less rebellion or no more rebellion than Lawrence Ricci, were pursued by the papacy and burned at the stake. And their heads were chopped off in guillotines. They were treated as heretics. And, as we know, I believe it was the Fourth Lateran Council that declared officially, as a matter of Roman Catholic canon law, it's no sin to kill a heretic. And that's how Rome justified the persecution and attempted extirpation and annihilation of Protestants. But here we have this Jesuit general who has developed this organization called the Jesuit Order, the Society of Jesus, which is now being abolished by the papacy and accused of abject rebellion against the authority of the papacy and the church. Yet, he's not beheaded. He's not burned at the stake. He's not stretched on the rack. He's just been arrested and held in confinement. Now it says the members of the Jesuit order were dispersed among the different ecclesiastical establishments in Rome. In other words, other monasteries and in other words, they weren't arrested as heretics. And yet we know that the papacy knows that every Jesuit is simply an extension of the mind of the Jesuit general. In true respect, they are just a clone of the Jesuit general. They cannot think, will, or do anything contrary to the Jesuit general. They have his mind, and they are at his unquestioning disposal to do whatever he orders them to do. And they listen to his voice as though it were the voice of God Almighty, ignoring the voice of the papacy and of the church, but blindly and unquestioningly fulfilling every order of the Jesuit general. In other places, in other books, they've been described as cadavers, or like a stick in the hand of an old man. And these Jesuits, who have sworn an oath to obey the Jesuit general, signed with a dagger dipped in their own blood, have been allowed to just take up residence in other church establishments, ecclesiastical establishments in Rome. They too would be regarded as in abject rebellion to the papacy, would they not? I mean, after all, they're not to listen to the voice of the white pope, only the voice of the black pope. So, from the get-go, every Jesuit is in abject rebellion to the papacy. They don't even acknowledge the papacy. They're not allowed to. And yet, the Roman Catholic Church places them in other Roman Catholic ecclesiastical establishments. Now he says their buildings were taken possession of in compliance with the order. Seals were placed upon their papers, the papers of the Jesuits. All their documents were gathered up and sealed, and their schools were turned over to the management of others. It doesn't say who they were turned over to, but you can bet they were turned over to other Roman Catholic monastic orders. Certainly, they didn't give them up to Protestants. They're still under Roman Catholic Church control. And it says proceedings were instituted against Lawrence Ritchie, the general, and other members of the society. Proceedings were instituted. Must have been a court hearing, right? It says proceedings were instituted against Ritchie, the general, and other members of the society, and he and the secretary, together with several of the prominent fathers, I would guess these to be Jesuit provincials, these prominent fathers, were sent to the castle at St. Angelo and held as state prisoners. That would be Vatican state prisoners. And it says the crimes charged against them, and of which they were convicted, were, quote, that they had attempted, both by insinuation and by more open efforts, to stir up a revolt in their own favor against the Apostolic See, against the papacy. And as we reiterated yesterday, or tried to, amongst all the interruption, that according to the constitution of the Jesuits, the only promise that the Jesuit general makes to the papacy, the only authority that the constitution of the Jesuits gives to the white pope over the Jesuit order is simply to go wherever the pope wants them to go. Nowhere does it give the power or authority or right of the white pope to command anyone in the Jesuit order. And yet, it says they stirred up a revolt. The Jesuits stirred up a revolt in their own favor against the Apostolic See. Well, certainly, it wasn't just now, at this time, that the papacy recognized that they were stirring up a revolt against the papacy. That had to be a reality to the papacy not long after the formal establishment of the Jesuit order. Clearly, they had a copy at the Vatican of this constitution. It was the constitution of the Jesuits that prompted Pope Paul III to institute the Jesuits. They had to know, and did know, according to R.W. Thompson, that the Jesuits were created from the very beginning without much Vatican control. And that was a concern of a college of cardinals that were assembled to review that constitution, and that was the concern they had, that they were not under the authority of the church. They were under the authority of the Jesuit general. And they saw the Jesuits as a potential threat. And here we have the very materialization of that threat, acknowledged now by the papacy, that the Jesuits are a grave threat to the papacy and the Apostolic See, the governing authority of the church. Now, what is the governing authority of the church? According to Roman Catholic canon law, it's to govern all the governments of the world. So it's a challenge between the Jesuit general and the white pope as to who's going to govern the governments of the world, who's going to control the governments of the world. It says that they had published and circulated throughout all Europe libels against the Pope, unquote, in one of which Clement XIV was charged with having been elected by simony. In other words, he bought the papal throne, illegally elected, that his papacy was not legitimate. In other words, he was an anti-pope, and declaring what the Roman Catholic Church calls sedevacantism. The throne is empty. And it says, and that 3 of the most prominent Jesuits, Fave, Forestier, and Gautier, were loudly repeating everywhere that the Pope was the Antichrist, unquote. And I remember reading this on the air the other day. They were right. But they need to throw the black papacy into this too. He too is Antichrist. Declaring himself to be the sole voice of God on the earth. That's in the Constitution. And it's evident by the oath sworn by every Jesuit, that they view the Black Pope, his gray eminence, as the sole voice of God on the earth. That is Antichrist. So, they're guilty of the same crime that the Protestants were, declaring the papacy to be the Antichrist. And yet, they're not burned at the stake. They're not sent to the Inquisition. They're not interrogated, stretched on the rack, and tortured by the most gruesome and horrendous terms. They're simply imprisoned and shuffled around to other Roman Catholic institutions, much like the pedophile priesthood is today. they're sent from parish to parish to avoid litigation and public condemnation, parish to parish, diocese to diocese, archdiocese to archdiocese, and finally, nation to nation. And if their troubles, their pedophilia follows them wherever they go, they wind up in the Vatican. Well, that's basically what they did to these Jesuit priests. They're not treating them as heretics, even though they've made an open rebellion against the papacy by defying the decree, the bull of suppression and extinction by Pope Clement XIV. This is very light handling by the Vatican of this rebellious opponent of the papacy, an abject opponent of the papacy. We see them as competitors for the papal throne. And certainly the papacy recognized the Jesuit general and his order as a threat to the papal chair. Yet, they were not tortured. They were not burned. Just held as prisoner for a while. And then set off to other church establishments. Now, many people view the suppression of the Jesuits as a real defeat for the Jesuit order. I think my listeners ought to look at this evidence more clearly, and I will suggest to you that this isn't what it appears to be on the surface, a defeat for the Jesuits. I see this as a potential for exponentially expanding the influence of the Jesuits around the world. And while it looks on the surface like the Jesuits are on the ropes, while all Europe is demanding their suppression and extinction and abolition forever, which was accomplished by Pope Clement XIV's bull, it's actually, in reality, an exponential expansion of the power and influence of the Jesuits. First of all, they didn't kill the Jesuit general. They didn't make an example of him like they did the Protestant reformers. They didn't haul off his priests to the Inquisition like they hauled off the Protestants who declared the papacy as Antichrist. No, they got entirely different treatment. Inexplicable compared to the way the Vatican responded to other opponents, other threats to the papal chair. Now, it says the society generally, the Jesuit order generally, but not unanimously, exhibited this same spirit of resistance to the Pope and the authority of the Church. So they're all heretics and schismatics, right? Should be treated like all heretics and schismatics are treated by the Roman Catholic Church. And it says, by the decree of abolition, the members, that is, the individual Jesuits, were allowed to act as secular priests and exercise sacerdotal functions. In other words, they could still offer the Mass, and they could still hear confessions, and they could still baptize babies and marry people. Are we to suppose that when they were released from the Jesuit order and placed into these sacerdotal positions, that they ceased to be Jesuits, having signed their oath with a dagger dipped in their own blood, and with promises to suffer all the wrath of the Jesuit order if they ever defy the Black Pope, the Jesuit general? Are we to suppose that one of these Jesuit priests, one or many or any number of these priests who just simply walked away from the Jesuit order, followed the instructions of their Pope in Rome, and just took one of these ordinary places among the priesthood to function as an ordinary Roman Catholic priest, no longer a part of Lawrence Ritchie's military, are we to suppose that they violated their oath and when approached by another former Jesuit, simply ignored him as having no authority in his life any longer? Those individual Jesuits who, through their training, have been so completely unmanned that they cannot think for themselves or be in direct violation of their bloody oath to the Black Pope. Are we to suppose, after all that brainwashing, after all those threats of eternal damnation and the eternal flames of hell for violating the command of their Jesuit general, with threats of being disemboweled for rebelling against the Jesuit general, are we to suppose that they did just function normally in the sacerdotal functions of the Roman Catholic Church? He says, R.W. Thompson says, a few of them availed themselves of this provision and, quote, settled themselves quietly in different capacities, unquote. I wonder what those different capacities were. In other words, they're sprinkled all throughout the church. Former Jesuits, now stripped of their identity, stripped of their mission, stripped of their oath, have reduced to a common priest. These Jesuits who have been taught from the cradle to grave that the papacy is inept and corrupt and immoral, and that the priesthood, the ordinary priesthood, are just as corrupt and debauched as the papacy. Would they willingly surrender their lofty position as Jesuits to find comfort and solace within the church against which they were rebelling? Or were they just gratuitously infiltrated as Jesuits into the ordinary priesthood? You see, was this really a defeat for the Jesuit order, or was it an incalculable victory? It's something we must consider. Now he continues, he says, others of these Jesuits endeavored insidiously to preserve the principle of their constitution and organization. What are the principles of the Constitution and their organization? Number one, to destroy the Protestant Reformation, to burn all heretics, schismatics, and liberals, and to conquer the world for the papacy. That's what their oath entails. Are we to believe that a Jesuit, upon the command of the Pope, would abandon that mission that they believe is divinely ordained, backed up by so many years of history of the Jesuits' so-called success in all the other mission fields in which they operated? We know that many of the priests took positions in the secular priesthood, but others kept their principles and their constitution and remained Jesuits. We'll talk about it more after the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com. 100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a Left Behind rapture scenario. This false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Inquisition Update. We're currently reading the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, recovering some vital area of this book. Before the break, we mentioned R.W. Thompson says, others of these Jesuits, after their suppression, endeavored insidiously to preserve the principles of their constitution and their organization. Okay, they wanted to continue to be Jesuits. They were in abject rebellion against the papacy, and they were going to go on about their business whether or not the Pope suppressed them or not. Whether or not all of Europe was opposed against them, they were going to continue to be Jesuits. But listen to what R.W. Thompson says next. They did this by abandoning the name of Jesuits and adopting other titles. Now here is where R.W. Thompson drops the ball. He suggests that the Jesuits, seeking to maintain their constitution and their principles and continue to be Jesuits and continue to operate under their normal operations, simply abandoned the name Jesuits and adopted other titles. What were those titles? R.W. Thompson doesn't tell us. And right here on this subject alone, R.W. Thompson could have written a third book. Stop to think. R.W. Thompson, Secretary of the American Navy, who is qualified to assess the gravest threats to our constitutional republic, foreign and domestic, who has set about to study the Jesuit order and write 2 books on the subject, declaring by these books that there's only one power on the earth that could overthrow this government, this constitutional republic, and replace it with a monarchical system, is the Jesuit order. And he says right here that the Jesuits abandoned their name, the Jesuits, and adopted other titles, but he doesn't tell us what they are. Now, at this point, I'm very disappointed in R.W. Thompson. And it's okay for me to be disappointed in R.W. Thompson. It's okay for you to be disappointed in R.W. Thompson, given the importance for us to know where these Jesuits went, who were going to maintain their constitution and the principles of their organization under different names. In other words, different names, different identities, disguises. They went underground. They were criminalized by the papacy. They couldn't continue to practice as Jesuits, dressed in Jesuit dress. They couldn't maintain their intrigues in the governments of the world as Jesuits. They had to appear to be something other than Jesuits. What were they? How would we recognize their hand in manipulating the governments of the world if they're not in Jesuit dress? If they're not going under the name Jesuit? How do we know that the Jesuit influence in the governments of the world had ceased simply because they changed their names and their appearances? R.W. Thompson drops the ball here, and I want to recommend to my listeners a book where this ball has been picked up again. And that is a book by P.D. Stewart called Code Word Babylon. He tells us that the Jesuits went underground and resurfaced as the Illuminati. And not only that, but after the abolition of the so-called Illuminati, the so-called abolition of the Illuminati, these Jesuits found refuge in Freemasonry. Freemasonry. They changed their name again to Freemasonry. Freemasons. They went from Jesuits to Illuminati to Freemasons. And not only that, but they infiltrated all the other secret societies. Even the Greek-lettered literary societies in the colleges and universities. And why would the Jesuits infiltrate those organizations? Because they're the great educators. They haven't changed their modus operandi. They still, even after their suppression, know the value of controlling education. And that's why they even infiltrated the Greek-lettered fraternities in the universities. Obviously, to get control of not just the Jesuit universities, but all the other universities. Some of them even Protestant universities, Protestant seminaries. Was this really a defeat for the Jesuit order? Or was it an attempt to exponentially increase the infiltration and dissemination of Jesuitism through other organizations by simply changing their name and their dress and their identity? R.W. Thompson completely abandons any more discussion. He simply says that they abandoned the name of Jesuits and adopted other titles. And that's the end of it. We don't hear any more from R.W. Thompson about what names, what titles, what occupations. he never even infers that they ceased to be Jesuits once they changed their names. Okay? What's missing here? Well, the suppression took place in 1773, right about the time the United States was forming its own government. And having been rejected in Europe, the Jesuits were given permission to find safe harbor in heretic nations, schismatic nations like Russia, where the Orthodox Church, the schismatic Eastern sect of the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox, or in this case the Russian Orthodox Church, they insinuated themselves in Russia. They found refuge under Catherine, Empress of Russia. And the Pope approved it, Pope Pius VII, the second successor after Clement XIV. They found refuge in Prussia, a Lutheran nation, only because Frederick was Lutheran, but he was also a monarchist. He claimed the papal divine right to rule. It's kind of mixing the waters, isn't it? A king who professes Protestantism but demands his divine right, which he knows he derives only from the papacy, much like King Henry VIII and other so-called Protestant kings throughout history who maintained their divine right to rule, like the throne of England. That divine right was instituted by the papacy during the Old World Order, and it still remains today. The divine right of kings, union of church and state, when the Bible clearly says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's. There's supposed to be a separation between church and state. But we have Protestant nations who have maintained the union of church and state, even the United States of America, despite the literal, physical prohibition against it in the Constitution. And why is that? Because the Jesuits found refuge in these found refuge in these heretic and schismatic nations: Russia, Prussia, and the United States. Remember, during the founding of our country, the Jesuits had been suppressed, but we know from the reading of the book The Ark and the Dove that Andrew White and several other Jesuits, the most prominent of which is John Carroll, came to this country and operated and even communicated with the papacy. Even built a Jesuit university, Georgetown University, in this country. They were not suppressed by the papacy. There was dialogue between John Carroll and the papacy. Why did not the Pope at that time, who was communicated to by John Carroll of Maryland, why was he not chastised by the papacy? Why was he not arrested for doing what Jesuits do, for operating under the name of Jesuit right here in this country? Because the papacy, while they were publicly suppressing the Jesuits in Europe to satisfy the monarchical kings of Europe, the Jesuits were left free to operate in Russia, Prussia, and the United States of America. You know what it looks to me like? The Vatican just vastly expanded the area of operations for the Jesuits at the very time that they were supposed to have been exterminated. Was the extermination of the Jesuit order by Pope Clement XIV really an attempt to suppress the Jesuits? Was this a defeat for the Jesuits, or was this an incomprehensible expansion of the operations of the Jesuits? And by now you have to be convinced what I think. Look, claims by divine right to rule the entire world. Look, he claims to be Jesus Christ himself under a veil of flesh, according to the papal bull Unum Sanctum. And that every man, woman, and child must be subject to the authority of the papacy. Now, up to that time, it was just Europe and India and, to some degree, Japan. But not Russia. not the United States. There was influence in South America. We talked about the Guarani, the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay, and how the Roman Catholic emperors of Spain and Portugal took over South America. But what about the colonies? What about Russia? And they even found refuge in Prussia, Protestant Prussia. They found refuge in Protestant USA, too. And not only that, but they helped found the government, and they even had controlling input in the design of our flag. And that brings me to another subject, which is appropriate to talk about at this time. I have before me a little booklet that I thrashed around in my library early this morning to find. My big library that's condensed into just a pile of books. I'm a little bit disorganized after having recently moved. But I found this little book. It's entitled Our Flag, or The Evolution of the Stars and Stripes. It's written by Robert Allen Campbell, and it's from a historical collection from the British Library. It's a little booklet that found circulation, a very limited circulation a long time ago, but is now being republished. And guess what it asserts? That at the time of the founding of our nation, the Declaration of Independence and the design of our flag here in this country was an advisor who sat in on all those discussions, described as an old man who is never identified by any other term but the professor. And he's given a very mysterious role in these discussions, these very secret discussions by the founding fathers, who would certainly be regarded by England as traitors, as rebels, under tremendous pressure to separate the colonies from British rule. And this mysterious man, who nobody knows but by the simple name, the professor, is interjecting himself. And he is listened to in stunned silence by the founders of our government. You know, it's against etiquette, and it's not the proper thing to do, but at this point, if I weren't bound by those limitations, I would interject the reading of this book right here at this point of the reading of R.W. Thompson's book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. But etiquette won't permit me to do it. I'm afraid it would detract too much from what what valuable things R.W. Thompson tells us in this book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. But sometime in the recent future, in the near future, I'm going to read this book, Our Flag, or The Evolution of the Stars and Stripes, and I'm going to introduce you to this man that they called the Professor and what role he played. And I simply suggest to you that it may have in fact been Lawrence Ritchie, the Jesuit general, who was supposedly imprisoned by the Vatican after the suppression of the Jesuits and interrogated. But it's very possible that, consistent with the thesis developed, that the suppression of the Jesuits was simply a very masterfully crafted design to exponentially increase the control and influence of the Jesuits in the remainder portion of the world, not yet under complete Vatican control, that Lawrence Ritchie, while he was supposedly in prison, was secretly whisked off to this country to help set up the government of the United States. without the knowledge of the people. It's going to be an interesting read, and I hope my listeners will diligently pay attention to the rest of the reading of this book in preparation for the reading of that book. Now, R.W. Thompson continues. He says, but, says Nicolini, the historian, we've referred to him many times, very valuable historian in these subjects. He says, quote, the greater part, that is the greater part of the Jesuits, the most daring and restless of them, would not submit to the brief of suppression, impugned its validity in 1,000 writings, called into question the validity of Pope Clement XIV's election, whom they called parricide, sacrilegious, simoniac, and considered themselves still forming part of the still existing company of Jesus, unquote. In other words, they were in abject rebellion, open and admitted rebellion against the papacy, and they were going to continue their operations, whether the papacy or the world or the monarchical kings of Europe or anybody else, including the Protestants and pilgrims of the colonies, objected. Now, R.W. Thompson stops here, and he starts talking about the refuge that the Jesuits found in Russia. Russian Orthodox Russia. It says, Catherine, Empress of Russia, had given some protection to the Jesuits before their suppression, and Lawrence Ritchie, the general, admitted in his examination, remember he was arrested, held at the Vatican, St. Angelo Castle. He was interrogated, tried in a court, found guilty for setting up an opposition to the papacy. He admitted in this examination that he had held correspondence with Frederick of Prussia after the decree. Okay? He had held correspondence with Frederick of Prussia after the decree. In other words, he didn't immediately comply with Pope Clement XIV's order of suppression. He continued his operations, and he was looking for a place of refuge, certainly. And he did this after the decree. Are we to suppose that this was just a brief lapse of loyalty to the papacy, or did Lorenzo Ritchie entirely continue to insist upon continuing to be the Jesuit general after the suppression? That's exactly what it looks like. And he says, how is it to be accounted for, in any mode consistent with the due respect of the Church, that the Jesuits in Russia did not withdraw themselves from the protection of the Emperor, and that others sought shelter and protection in Prussia after the decree of the Pope had declared the order to be forever abolished throughout the world? Clearly, the Jesuit general is demonstrating, Pope Clement XIV, we're going on about our business. We're going on about our business. We're not going to submit. You have to ask your question. You have to ask this question. If Lawrence Ritchie demonstrated this type of rebellion against the papacy, how is it that he allowed himself to be arrested in the first place? If he knew he was going to be an abject rebellion against the papacy, which he demonstrated that he did, how in the world did he allow himself to be arrested? Or did he plan to be arrested? Did he plan to be taken out of public view and placed in the Vatican so that the Vatican could do something entirely different with him? Or that he could use the Vatican to do something entirely different with him? Like help found the government of the United States, help write the Declaration of Independence, help establish the flag of the United States of America, to help establish the government of America? Was Lawrence Ritchie the professor? Did the Vatican know all about this? Was the Vatican fully in compliance with this? Was Clement XIV knowledgeable of all this? How about Pope Pius VI and Pope Pius VII? It doesn't look at all like a defeat for Jesuitism. It looks like an exponential expansion of their power and influence in the world not yet claimed, not yet fully claimed by the papacy. He said Russia had long before rejected all the overtures of the Roman Catholic Church. Remember, Russia is Orthodox. It's controlled by the schismatic church, the Orthodox Church. Rome wants control of Russia, has always wanted control of Russia, has always wanted the extirpation and annihilation of the schismatic and heretical Orthodox. Certainly, they have made repeated overtures toward Russia to replace the Orthodox Church with the Roman Catholic Church. It said Russia had long before rejected all the overtures of the Roman Church and established a Greek faith, the Orthodox faith, as the religion of the state, with the reigning sovereign as the spiritual head of the national church. But look, the Jesuits found refuge in Russia. Those set in power to conquer all the other religions of the world and bring them beggingly to the feet of the Pope. They found refuge in Orthodox Russia, just like they found refuge in Protestant Prussia and Protestant USA. What do you suppose their operations were in Russia? These former Jesuits, who were openly in rebellion against the bull of suppression and extinction, and demanded to continue to their operations, their principles, and preserve their constitution. What do you suppose their mission was in Russia? Maybe some think that I'm beating this over the head. Maybe you've already gotten it. But we're going to continue with this subject tomorrow on the program. And I want my listeners to put their thinking caps on and see if you can find something in this that I've missed. We'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update. Stay tuned for more on FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The rapture will be canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.